at least when I was a kid, what really touched me or got my attention was when an adult was able to connect with me because they met me at my level. And I had a sense that they understood what I was going through. And if I felt even the slightest bit that this person has no idea what I'm going through, then I just turned off.
Yeah.
And it's such a delicate, thing, because kids are smart and they see a lot and they can interpret a lot more than we realize.
Welcome to the 46th episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest was born in Seoul, South Korea. After spending 1.5 years in Korea, she moved to Japan. She attended a local Japanese public school from kindergarten through 9th grade. After finishing junior high, she experienced her first school with English instruction in Wales for a year. By the time she got over the culture shock in Wales, she returned to Japan, and upon return, she attended Saint Maur International School from 2005 to 2008. She then attended Harvard University, where she studied sociology and psychology and graduated in 2013. In high school, she was best known for her academic and running career. She broke the Tama Hills Girls cross-country record in 2007. She continued to run competitively at Harvard, where she competed for the Greater Boston Track Club, setting personal bests in the 5K at 17 minutes and 53 seconds, and at the marathon at 2 hours and 56 minutes. She returned to Japan in 2013 and has been teaching IB biology and general science at Saint Maur International School ever since. Outside of education, she works as a translator, researcher, and writer. She is currently working on a novel, which she hopes to finish before she is 80 years old. She lives in Hayama, Japan, with her 2 cats, dog, and partner. She continues to train and race competitively with the hope of running an Olympic trials qualifier, which, for those who are not aware, is 2 hours and 45 minutes. So about 10 minutes off her personal best. So not too far off. Welcome to the podcast, Anna.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be on the show.
So today we'll talk a little bit about running, you becoming a teacher, the IB system, something actually I'm kind of intrigued about, being a TCK, as well as this book you plan on finishing by age 80. So you have quite a bit of time, I guess, until you finish that. So we spoke a bit off air that normally I like to go chronological, but trying to mix things up. And I think we're going to sort of go maybe back and forth in times. So I want to start off with this book. So you're a writer, researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about this book that you're working on that you hope to complete in this decade or this century?
Well, it's been in the oven for about, I would say, a good 8 years or so. Sort of the idea that I've always wanted to write something that was about being a TCK, but most importantly about write something about cultural liminality, but I wanted to write it in Japanese and have it simultaneously be published in English and in Japanese, because I feel like there are a lot of books out there that are about crossing cultures that are in English. There are plenty in Japanese as well, but I want to write something that's sort of semi-autobiographical, but also has a wider theme about what it's like to grow up particularly in Japan. Seeing two sides of when you're seeing, two different cultural views at the same time, and what that feels like. Whereas I think a lot of books that are written about cross-cultural transitions and crossing cultures, a lot of the times the protagonist is switching back and forth. And I've never found myself switching back and forth. There was always this mix or this new kind of cultural view that was a mixture of Japan, the US, and any other bits and pieces I picked up along the way. I've got sort of several half-finished chapters. And when I realized that I really am terrible at coming up with storylines, now I sort of switched gears and thought, well, maybe I'll just write short essays that are much more sort of narrative and like basically stories of like snapshots of our lives, me and my brother's lives growing up. Because it's hard to write something, when you start thinking about a story, then you start thinking about like, well, the plot line and what has to happen next. And I started to feel myself like move away from what it was that I was trying to write. And so that's sort of what I've been working on. It really is still it's a skeleton, which is why if I can finish it by the time I'm 80, I'll be lucky.
So, I mean, when we're talking about writing a book, I feel like when it comes to, one's writing fluency and ability, it's like the pinnacle, right? You have to be really on top of your game. And I think it's a common question you probably get a lot. How do you manage to keep a high level in writing in both in English and Japanese? Because a lot of people speak both languages, right? But how are you able to write at a high level?
I think it really goes back to those spending my formative years in Japanese school. And particularly, I think was crucial were the years between 7th and 9th grade, what Japanese called chugakko, junior high. Because I think that's when you really, Japanese elementary school, I feel like they do a really good job. In fact, when I think of what our school is trying to do in elementary school, which is, more student-centered instruction, I feel like that's what Japanese elementary school tends to do, or at least when the school that I went to tended to do. And it's really in junior high that you sort of buckle down and they start socializing you into Japanese society. And so you learn all the proper mannerisms, you learn the proper etiquette when you're writing. And it gets a little bit more rigorous, particularly because that's partially because, you're getting prepared to sit for the entrance exams into high school. So I think it was really, I had a good foundation back then. Plus, it's kind of hard. I tell my students this a lot because when they find out where I went to college, they all sort of go like, oh my God. But I say like, look, when I was in junior high, I was getting 2s and 3s, which equate to about C's and D's in grades because I wasn't really paying attention. I was not that interested in learning at all. And instead, I was writing stories in class. I had these campus notebooks and I was just like writing stories and they're terrible. I still have them and I read back and I'm like, what is this? But I think I got a lot of practice back then. And then I feel a little rusty these days because I'm just not writing as often as I should or want to. But I did get a little bit more practice in developing both my English and Japanese vocabulary actually when I was the summer after my sophomore year in college, when I was still trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do, because I had initially thought that I wanted to go into academia, but was gradually realizing that I think I want to go into academia because I know I'm good at school and I'm afraid to go into the world of work, and that's not the right reason to go to grad school. And so I did an internship at the Wall Street Journal for about 10 weeks. And I was in charge. The blog has since closed down, unfortunately, but they had this blog, a news blog called Japan Real Time. And it was, the journal is a subscription based, so you have to usually pay, but the blog was free. And so it was a way to try and catch new readers and younger readers especially. So I was writing articles, but they had a Japanese site, a Japanese version and an English version. And so I was writing for both. So essentially I was writing the same article in English and Japanese.
Wow.
Like any good translator knows, I guess there's two camps of translators. There are those who say, no, you have to translate everything verbatim, word for word. And then there are others like myself who believe that what's important is getting the same meaning across. So your words change a little bit, the sentence might change a little bit. So I was doing that. And I know it was just 10 weeks, but it still was such a rich, intense 10 weeks that I felt like afterwards my writing had really changed for the better.
That's really interesting. You mentioned, writing in both languages. I feel like for a lot of international school kids, they kind of have the reverse, experience that you had, where you were really trained in the Japanese language and you started English later on. Do you feel like at certain points in your career as a writer, or just, in general as a human being, has your level in regards to writing fluency evolved like powerfully in one direction or the other in regards to Japanese versus English?
Yeah, I really do feel that. So my academic English, particularly when it comes to, writing essays, writing papers, that is my dominant one is no question, it's English. That's, 4 years at Harvard will do that to you. because you're really forced to, improve and refine your writing. And I do feel that I have in terms of writing, not actually speaking, in terms of writing, I have a wider vocabulary in English than in Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to writing dialogue or even in conversation, sort of the spoken language, I guess, I feel much more comfortable and fluent in Japanese. So when I write, it's really difficult for me to write. Like, for example, I sometimes translate. My brother owns a consulting company. He does a lot of work with in the field of regenerative medicine, and sometimes he'll throw me work to translate. And it's sometimes it's like a protocol of a clinical trial, like what they're going to do. And what I find is when I translate something like that's in English into Japanese, it's very challenging for me to make the Japanese sound formal in the way that it would appear if it was written by a Japanese person, as opposed to this, it sounding like something that was translated from a very formal English piece of writing. Whereas if I have a Japanese piece of writing, same thing, a Japanese protocol, and I need to translate that into English, it's much easier for me to do that and make it sound natural.
That's really interesting that you mentioned, so if it's something like clinical trials, at least there's a bit of, I guess you could say, a structure in regards to writing. Because I was just thinking probably the pinnacle of translation would become when you have to begin to translate things like, fictional pieces of work. And I was just thinking off the top of my head, like Haruki Murakami. I'm not sure if you've ever read both languages of him. I don't understand either. I mean, I both English and Japanese. I'm always kind of blown away. I don't know if it's a good thing, if it's my lack of, vocabulary, but I've always been really intrigued. I think he has the same translator, though. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying. I think he trusts his translator enough that the translator...
I have the impression that he wrote his own. I'm not sure, though. Maybe he does both, or maybe I've got the wrong information. But yeah, to be honest, his work kind of is a little bit beyond me sometimes. But I have read his work. What did I read? I've read two, actually. One was The Wild Sheep Chase, I think it was called. And then the other one was What I Talk About When I Talk About Running.
Okay. Yeah, that one's a little bit more...
A lot more digestible.
Yeah. He's definitely a little bit of a challenge for, I guess, anyone involved in the translating industry.
Yeah. and I tend to be, I like to think that I'm creative and, abstract, but I think deep down I'm an incredibly literal person. So it's really difficult for me sometimes to sort of, read, incredibly nuanced things. And so I have to read it a couple times to really sort of wrap my mind around it.
That's interesting. And speaking of linguistics,
yes.
I think this would be a sort of good segue into, your academic journey. It's quite unique. There's a lot of big transitions. And yes. I think, probably the biggest first transition is 9 years, if I'm not mistaken, in Japanese public school.
9 years plus like 3 years in kindergarten.
So yeah, so I guess a decade plus, and then you go to Wales. So this is sort of a two-parter. I mean, first of all, what was it like being this, essentially this Caucasian girl in a Japanese school? And I imagine most Japanese schools don't have many non-Japanese natives. And then when you left the Japanese school, now you were sort of in a reverse, like minority situation where, your skin color might have been, white, but you were definitely not the average type of student. So what was that whole experience like?
Well, to start off, the reason my brothers and I, my brothers are 7 and 8 years older than me. And so, and our dad, my mom was also both my parents, they met in the Navy. They went at officer candidate school, but by the time I was born, my mother had quit the Navy, but we moved around because of, wherever my father's ship went, and so, or wherever his orders were. But he retired when I was 6 years old. And so I was already in Japanese kindergarten, elementary school. But my parents put us in Japanese school for a couple reasons. One, they couldn't afford international school because they wanted to make sure that they saved for college. for the three of us. My father, had grown up he's American, but he grew up in the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. So, living overseas was not new to him. I am convinced it was some sort of social psychological experiment that they did to sort of dump us in Japanese school and see what would happen. But, I don't think I say that jokingly, but the big thing was, for us to gain the language and culture, and they made it very clear to the school, and actually it's in Hayama. I grew up in Hayama. When they enrolled us, they said, look, we don't want our kids to have any special treatment. So, we're not going to make a fuss. We're not going to insist that, they bring their own lunchbox instead of eating the bento that is provided, etc. And so it literally was, I think the earliest memories I have, actually, they're both good. Let me rephrase this. There were a lot of challenges that when I look back, I think, gee, that was really rough to go through at that age, because it was so beyond me. I didn't have the vocabulary to explain what was happening in terms of navigating the cultural differences and the tension. And I absorbed so much of that, and yet I didn't have the vocabulary to really express how it made me feel and what was going on. At the same time, though, when I think about if I had the opportunity to do it over again, would I rather go to, a non-Japanese school? The answer is no. I would rather go to the Japanese school, because that experience really, shaped who I am and has enabled me to do so many things that I can do. But to give you an idea, my earliest memory of being in Japanese school is actually in kindergarten. And Hayama is really close to the Yokosuka Naval Base where my dad was stationed. And so there are, every year there would be a few non-Japanese kids either in the kindergarten or elementary school. And when I was like my second year in kindergarten, there was an influx of a couple of Americans. And I had already sort of established a group of friends, Japanese friends. And I remember that I didn't know the days of the week, but I knew that I would alternate days that I played with the Japanese kids and the days I would play with the American kids, because and I had this rule that I could not mix the two, because if they mixed, I would end up being the translator. And neither of my friends would be happy, because my Japanese friends would want me to play with them and do their game, and my American friends want me to do their game. And I was constantly, being the switchboard operator.
And this was all in elementary school.
This was kindergarten.
Oh, kindergarten.
Yeah.
That is so much to, yeah.
That was, but then my mother, particularly my mother, understood what what was going on. And so she was really, my father, he was the XO, he was the chief engineer. And so he sort of, he's a really warm person, but, isn't always good at expressing it in a way that, a little kid would need. So he would be super rational, whereas my mother would just like take me in her arms and hug me and like, yes, I know it's hard. Elementary school, things calmed down a little bit. Again, for a while, I was the only American, and there was a little teasing at first. It happens in every third or fourth grade year around the world, the cooties game, where, you touch someone and they have cooties and you pass it to the next person.
Yeah.
And because I was a gaijin, I had special cooties.
Yeah.
Things like that. But I had a really good group of girlfriends and particularly one friend, Tomoko, who were still very close, even though, we've not seen each other for a long time. Every time we get in touch, it's like time hasn't elapsed at all. And so I had a tight friendship group, but there was always a little bit of tension because, when I would go home, we had this life that was really different from my Japanese friends. Particularly, it's like, my mother worked, which is not uncommon now among Japanese families, but back then it was still uncommon for, mom to work. We had a otetsutai-san, we had a nanny who is much more like my Japanese mom. She was with us for like 9 years.
Oh, wow.
And so we had this sort of hybrid life where it was sort of American, but it wasn't really American because, you know, America to us was the naval base, which is definitely not America. And yet, you know, at school it was a Japanese school. And the next time that I think, you know, the big cultural tension was intense was actually around 4th grade, when a couple of other Americans came into the school. And like 4th grade, 5th grade, that's when social tension gets a little intense among kids. I've noticed this even in teaching.
Yeah.
There's a lot more tension, but within girls, especially, and friendship groups and cliques and all things like that. And you know, you're right before puberty. And I remember there being a lot of tension because I was sort of expected to be the translator a little bit. And there was also a little bit of bullying towards them. And I used to worry deep down that, well, and you know, they would be, my Japanese friends would be saying things about the other American kids behind their backs, but I could understand it because I could understand Japanese. And I remember really getting worried and this deep anxiety. I think that's when my chronic anxiety really started, because I used to worry that, well, if they're saying that about them, what are they saying about me? And you know, and there was a lot of unkind things that they might not have meant it to be malicious, but it just was. And so that was really hard. And then in junior high, again, it calmed down a lot more because I think by then I was the only American in my junior high. And I was the only foreigner. But Hayama is such a small town that basically you're with the same group of kids from kindergarten through 9th grade.
Yeah.
And so everyone knows everyone. And people have kind of forgotten that I was not Japanese, or it just became a non-issue. And so, you know, the only time it really showed up was when we were learning English, because I had to sit through English class. And
yeah.
I was just, you know, the ALT would come in and like make a beeline. Like I could see them looking at me, and I was like, don't you dare call on me, because I do not want to, like, I just did not want any attention called to the fact that I, you know, was not Japanese. So I didn't want to, like, my friends would say, can you pronounce this word in English? Because it sounds so nice when you say it. And I really didn't want to do it. So like whenever we were reciting something in English class, I would read it in katakana English so that I wouldn't stand out.
That's intriguing.
So I think, so a lot of those years, I think what was good was that it really gave me a firsthand experience of what it's like to grow up as a Japanese, because culturally I was Japanese. And it was, you know, that was often challenging when, you know, the curse of any TCK or immigrant child is that you're the go-to translator when your parents need a translator. And, you know, I would often not want to translate the things that my parents wanted me to translate because I would feel like they were too direct. And so that was the good thing. The downside was that it really did a number on, I do feel that it did a number on my self-confidence, in that I was always trying to hide and not draw any attention to myself.
And I think you phrased it really well, that it's like, you know, we all go through social, emotional challenges, especially growing up. But it just seems like everything you faced was like 5 years, 6 years sort of ahead of when normally people have to deal with, you know, these type of issues, or even a decade ahead. What was interesting to me is you said, so, you know, in elementary school there were other foreign students, which almost complicated things, and then when middle school came, you know, you were the only one, which simplified things. Do you, as sort of now as an educator, I know Saint Maur is far more, heterogeneous demographic in comparison to a public school in Kanagawa. But how do you see your experience sort of affecting the way you manage classrooms with multiple races, as well as just a school that has, an ethos of sort of internationalness?
That's a good question. I think, I don't know if this like answers your question, or is answers your question in sort of in a way that the answer that you're looking for. But what I find when I'm teaching is I can't wear what I call the teacher mask. I can't be anybody but myself. And so, and what I mean by that is I guess what I try to do with my body language, with the way I talk to the kids, is I want them to let them know that, hey, I get it, because each of them, like every TCK story is different. I mean, even the label TCK is now being disputed, because the whole point of a third culture kid is that you don't fit into any category. So every single TCK is different, and you can't really summarize, the experience of a TCK. But there are certain, I think, common things that you do go through. I try to sort of let them know, verbally, non-verbally, that, hey, I get it. You can come talk to me. My classroom is a safe place. I'm not going to assume any kind of common sense or common knowledge. And I find that a lot of, like, for example, I actually, when I teach, I tend to use a lot of analogies and metaphors. And so I try to draw on my own experiences and, metaphors that would make sense to someone who's, used to navigating two different cultures and negotiating them. And particularly with the IB, I mean, the IB makes that a little bit easier, because that's kind of like their whole philosophy is, we expect you to cross cultures. We expect you to be this patchwork quilt of many different cultural perspectives. And what I also try to do is, because my own experience was such that I walked away, or I came out of that cross-cultural educational experience with such a mixed feeling. And sometimes the negatives would feel much more magnified than the positives.
Yeah.
I feel like what I try to do is I try to show students how, yes, it's tough, but look at what this enables you to do that other people can't do.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I'm really happy that you're looking at it through a very sort of multifaceted perspective, that it's not this, what frustrates me personally as someone who's also sort of a TCK, I say sort of because in my case, my mother's Japanese, right? And I grew up in Japan. So it's like, my challenges probably aren't quite as challenging as, say, like, there's students at my current school. I'm in Korea. It's a fairly homogeneous population and, non-Korean. But I see the positives of multiculturalism. But as you've stated, there's also so many complex issues, and there's nuance. And there is sort of people who are not exposed to this sort of sometimes come into it kind of with this kumbaya mentality. It's like, let's have, 20, nationalities get together, and, we're all just going to experience each other's, food, different food, and, learn how to say hello in other languages. I just feel like it's so much more nuanced than that. And of course, I mean, nuance is a tough thing. It's not something, that one could elaborate in a short time period. But, hearing your stories, it's quite illuminating that, you had this positive experience overall. I mean, where you are now, I'm assuming is where you want to be in life, but there were those challenges of balancing friend groups when you were 5 years old, just like not what you expect, 5-year-old to deal with.
And I think you sort of, you nailed it there, because a lot of times, like, I find myself, running into the same headache and, kind of hitting my head against the wall, because particularly Hayama, the town, is one of the host towns for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, if it's going to happen. And the sailing team, the British sailing team, has been training in Hayama for a while. So there was this big push in the town to, get people to be much more welcoming and, basically to, have many more cross-cultural sessions and seminars. And so they did this big survey to interview, and they keep saying the foreigners who live in Hayama. And I was like, why don't we just call them non-Japanese residents, or, something that doesn't highlight the fact that they're different, and just, treat them like people. Like, not, don't look at me and think Anna the gaijin. Just look at me and say, oh, that's Anna. And once you stop seeing, that difference, that's when I feel like you finally reach a level of, internationalism that is really meaningful. And luckily at Saint Maur, we're a really good school in that the kids are just amazing. Every school has its own kinks, and our school is no exception, but we have such wonderful people, both on the educator side as well as the kids. And what I find time and time again amazes me about the kids is that they just accept each other for who they are. It's just like, oh, okay, and what I find is that probably is the most comforting thing. I mean, even for me, what I complained a lot about Saint Maur when I was there as a student. Most kids do complain about high school. But what I did appreciate was that my classmates in particular, they were okay with me. They didn't, treat me differently just because I was not really social. I was probably a little bit of a nerd. I didn't socialize that much. But they still treated me like a decent person. I never got picked on. They let me be. And there was that mutual respect. And I think that comes from, just being used to the fact that, okay, not everybody sees the world the way you do. Not everyone orients themselves towards the world the way you do. And that's normal. And there's no reason to be threatened by it. And I think what happens is we tend to see internationalism as, like you said, this whole, everyone is going to come to this common understanding. It's going to be all kumbaya. We're going to respect each other. But actually, I think it was former President Obama said this a couple of years ago in an interview, but, initially globalization and internationalism, when people from very different backgrounds come together, what people initially experience is fear, because it's unknown. They're not, it's something that's different. And our, I'm the biologist here, but, our evolutionary instinct is when something is different or unfamiliar, it means it's potential danger. And so it tends to, it can tend to splinter us off because we look and hold on to people and communities that share our beliefs and share our ideas and perspectives, because it feels safe. And I think my experience now that I'm older and I look back, and I sometimes have this, like, when I start to get, like, I do have these, like, bubbles of anger that occasionally come up about, oh, it was so hard back then because of this. I sort of, like, have this mental image that I have where I take myself as I am now and I go back in time and I sort of, hug myself back then and say, look, you're going through a really uncomfortable situation because you're experiencing something different that's uncomfortable. Your friends are experiencing something different and is uncomfortable, and you're all reacting in the only way that you know how. And which is by putting up a wall and protecting yourself and going into your cocoon. It's unfortunate that has to happen, but it does. All you can do is just keep chipping away at it so that, gradually that cocoon breaks down and people will start to open up a little bit.
And you were saying earlier how you like analogy. I don't know if that's an analogy, but whatever. It's an expression. I want to ask you a little bit about Tama Hills first. I ran two myself, actually, not quite as competitive as you did. But how was that transition, from Japanese public school Wales to Saint Maur. Was this ignited when you got to Saint Maur, or is this already something that
Yeah,
exists?
actually, that's a good question, because actually in my family, running, my dad was in the Navy, like I said, so PT, physical training, was kind of part of your job. So
Mm,
he'd been running since his early 20s. And he'd still be running, but he just had knee replacement surgery. So now he bikes mostly. But my dad and my older brother Ian, Colin also ran a little bit, but not not voluntarily. But Ian actually started the cross country team at Saint Maur
oh, wow.
with my coach, who now no longer coaches at Saint Maur, but he wanted a cross country team, so they grabbed a couple of basketball kids and said, "Hey, run with the cross country team. You'll get in shape, and in exchange, we'll play basketball for you." So they did, and when I was in Wales, that was a huge culture shock, like you very accurately described. I was, to them, I was a Yankee, but I had no cultural reference of what it's like to be an American. So I
Mm,
was just, just weirdo, basically. Um, but what I did end up doing was I'd started running a little bit in junior high, mostly because in my family, running is like brushing your teeth, and you just was sort of like, you just did it.
mm,
But also, I found like when I would run, it would give me this sense of peace. I was also going through some body image issues, and running gave me this sense of feeling more comfortable with myself.
mm.
Um, and then when I was in Wales, I sort of like, running was my coping mechanism, and so I would run to sort of deal with the stress of the cultural shock. And I guess that sort of paid off, because I wasn't really competing. I did one cross country race because no, I did two cross country races because no one wanted to do cross country, and everyone knew that I was the weird American who ran, and so they're like, "Can you just be on the cross country team for us?" I did that.
Yeah.
But I wasn't fast there. And then when I came to Saint Maur, it was just sort of like expected that I would join the team, because Ian had been on the team, and there's this new Novick in town. And
Mm,
so I joined, and I wasn't expecting to be fast at all. But that year we had a really good team, especially the girls' team. And as I recall, we came in second in the league after ASIJ. And we cheered more with much more um, alacrity than ASIJ did when they won, because we were just so psyched about being second.
mm,
But that was I sort of in my first race, I ended up winning it, but it was total surprise. And and then it was just like, oh, I guess this is something I'm really good at. So then over that first year, I think I got down to the record at the time was 13:02. No, yeah, 13:02 for the girls 2.1 mile course. And as you know, there's that one big hill in the girls course, which you get to run, and then you get to run another hill as the boys do.
yeah.
Uh, and so my, I think that my fastest time as a sophomore was like 13:28 or something, 13:29. And then I started to realize that, hey, maybe I could actually get the record. So throughout the year, I did basketball for one season. And my coach at the time, who actually I now work with, who is actually a former classmate of my brother, apparently saw me with the basketball and sort of said, "Has she ever seen a basketball before?" So I'm not athletic at all.
Mm,
Like, I have no hand-eye coordination. And so after that, I was just like, I'm not going to do any other sports. I'm just going to run. So I just ran throughout the year. And
mm,
then junior year, my first race, I ran 13:08.
mm.
And then the second race, I ran 13:06. And then 13:06. So it was like, okay, when am I going to get the last 4 seconds? And I ended up not doing it that year. I didn't get the record that year. And I even lost finals. I won every single race except the Kanto finals.
Mm.
And so I was really, really angry. So I trained like a demon the next year. Um, and then I broke it my senior year, but again, it was you remember senior year, you're exhausted because you're doing college applications. For us, we were doing the IB, so all the big assessments were due in that first term. It was super stressful. I was taking the SATs, and I remember showing up to the race, and I had been trying to break the record, but I was slowing down for some reason. So I was running like 13:30s, 13:40s, and I'd given up, like that it's not going to happen. And the day I broke it, though, I hadn't really slept the night before. And it had been a really stressful week, a lot of personal things going on. And I just remember getting to the starting line and thinking, I just want this to be over. But then we started, it was the first time I experienced what it feels like to be in the zone where, and it was probably good that I wasn't trying, because it probably turned my brain off. So my body just knew what to do, and I wasn't trying to control every single part of the race. And I just let my body go. And it felt super easy. I felt like I was gliding, and there was so little effort. And I kept thinking, like, okay, I'm going to start feeling sluggish soon. It's going to start to hurt soon. And it never came. And I've only had 2 to 3 other races like that after, that race. But yeah, running was, and still is, an incredibly important part of my identity. Partially because, or probably a big part of that, is not just that I feel strong when I'm running, and I like, the improvement that I can see, but also because of, one, the fact that it doesn't matter what country you're from or what your background is. All runners feel the same in a marathon at mile 18. Everybody feels the exact same way. And there is this, it feels like this community that, like, going back to the cultural side, it really crosses cultures, because you share this passion, and you don't have to speak the same language. You don't have to come from the same area, but you all understand it, and you all understand how important it is to you. So similarly, in college, I ran for the Greater Boston Track Club, and that was a deliberate decision. I didn't want to run for Harvard, because I wanted to keep my athletic career separate from my academic career. And that was really good, because GBTC, as we call it, it's a club team, and it's got a really long history. Like Bill Rogers was a member, Alberto Salazar was a member for a really short time. People come from all parts of life. So my best friend in college was actually, and we're still very good friends, she was a mother of 3, well, 2 and then 3. She gave birth to her 3rd son my senior year. And her husband was doing his residency, after medical school. And so we would run together every morning. Like she would leave her house. I would leave my dorm at like 5:15 in the morning, and we'd meet along the Charles and then run together. But what taught me, and what was really good about GBTC, was like, I looked around, and there were people who, were, regular working people, and at various, there were various ages, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and they still had this competitive edge. And that taught me that, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to stay competitive as long as I possibly can. And I don't want to give this up. And what that means is it's just going to take consistency, where you just train and you compete. And so deep down, I don't know if it's possible, but my ultimate goal is a 2:45. I've had a couple setbacks because I've had some stress fractures over the past couple years. And so I'm hoping, knock on wood, the next 4 years will be the big push.
Yeah, your personal best, so is about 11 minutes off, right? The 2:45. And what exactly is the significance of that 2 hours and 45 minutes? What does it let you do?
Well, so what it does is, so in the US, before the Olympics, they hold the Olympic trials race. And basically the top three of that race, the top three finishers go to the Olympics, and they have a women's race and a men's race. And, they could just have the race with the top 10 runners in the country, but that's no fun. And so they open the field up to, there's two tiers of qualifications. There's the A qualifiers, and those are the people for women who run under, I think it's like 236 or 235. Like the super fast people, the people who actually have a chance of going to the Olympics. And if you make that, it's called the A standard. And if you make an A standard, basically USATF, USA Track and Field will pay for your transportation, everything. You get all the special treatment. But if you break 245, and a couple years back they actually made it. It's called the B standard, but a few years back they actually changed it to 243 and realized that narrowed the field too much. So they brought it back up to 245.
Yeah.
If you break 245, then you have to pay for your own expenses. So, like, if the race is in Atlanta, you got to pay for your hotel and everything, but you can race. So it's kind of like, for us, there's this group of runners who aren't elite, but we take running a little bit too seriously to be called, a recreational runner. And so for those of us who are in that category, making the Olympic trials, or at least even setting a qualifying time, is kind of like us going to the Olympics.
How big is that pool then, that B class race?
I think the trials, gosh, I think they get at least 80 runners. And you can actually watch, if you go to USATF and you go to, Olympic trials, you can actually click and they'll update the list of runners who've qualified.
Wow. So, I mean, that's a smaller pool than I thought. So if you cut that 245, you're sort of bona fide top 200 runners in the United States. Like, you could basically say that without hesitation.
Yeah. Wow. But going from a 256 to a 245, it's 11 minutes, but that's the difference between a 640 mile or 642 mile and a 630. And that, especially for like my body, is a huge difference. And it's always been interesting because my marathon times, if you look at my 10K time, which is a 37:30, then then you look at my marathon time says I should run a much faster 10K. But because I am so terrible at anything that requires speed and explosive speed, particularly in a 10K, it's a longer race, but you're still running that at pretty much tempo pace, which is it's a pretty fast clip.
That's interesting that the world of running, people who aren't involved forget that there is quite a range. I think for most people though, I mean, more than 5K is a long, so there's not much of that differentiation. Yeah.
It's like, there's this, people think that the elites don't feel, as like, they don't feel the pain of the race as much as we do. It's like, yes, they feel the same pain that we do, except that they feel the pain at a much faster pace than we do.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
what you're doing is you're training your body to basically feel, there's a certain way you should feel in a marathon race. And what you're trying to do is you're training your body, your muscles, your skeletal system, your cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, everything. You're trying to train your body to basically feel that way at a much faster pace.
And do you coach currently at Saint Maur?
Yes, I do. I coach cross country. I used to coach track, and then we only usually get like 2 or 3 people who are interested in track, and I just said no. So yeah, just cross country.
And you mentioned this earlier, Saint Maur getting second place, and obviously, 90% of the people listening to this podcast kind of know the sizes of the school. But can we just sort of reiterate? Because I also myself need to sort of confirm, how large is Saint Maur? And FYI, ASIJ is about 500 in the high school.
Okay, so our entire school is the size of your high school, and by entire school, I mean from Montessori through 12th grade.
Okay, so the high school would be about 40 a grade?
less than that. I would say approximately 30 per grade.
Per grade. So about 60 girls in the high school.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I always think of, schools like YS, CAJ, Saint Maur, whenever there's a sports program that clicks, it's like there's always a lot of effort behind that, because it's not as simple as just, putting up a poster. Like, you really need to recruit and have students who are committed.
Lucky, because cross country, we built a legacy, and I mean, there are ups and downs. Like this year, our seniors were pretty thin. We don't have many seniors, but you get these pockets of kids, because I coach them from grade 6 until they're grade 12. So like, if you can catch them in grade 6, and then it's like you just keep them well fed and watered, and they'll recruit each other. And it's just that you can't be choosy. We're not going to have the same kind of athletic prowess that Kinnick or ASIJ or CAJ has, just because our pool is much smaller. And so we've had to adjust our philosophy, and I've had to adjust my philosophy, although it was a pretty easy transition from one that's hyper competitive to, okay, what are the other things that our kids can learn by participating in cross country, and what is the value of participating in this sport that is unique to this sport. And that tends to, and this can transition into the IB, is that it tends to really map on nicely to sort of the IB learner profile of being a risk taker and resilient learner, and all sorts of really valuable skills that we want our kids to have by the time they graduate.
So you've seen this IB program through the lens of both a student and as an educator. What do you think is sort of the drive behind this? IB's, as far as I'm concerned, only increasing, right, in regards to the size of the demographics of people taking it. What attracts people towards IB? And, furthermore, what are sort of the kinks you see in the program, though, that maybe could use some improvement?
Well, I think there are two camps of the kinds of people who are attracted to the IB. One is they only see the IB on, and actually, they're not completely out of line, is that they see the IB as this, academically rigorous program that is going to give them advanced credit or advanced placement in colleges. And that and especially now the IB program is trying to, a lot of Japanese schools are trying to implement the IB program. And I find that, from what I understand, a lot of the upper echelons in the government don't really understand what the IB is about. And they just see it as, oh, this is, a global standard of education, and so we're going to implement it. So this is really superficial level of understanding, that it's not completely inaccurate, because yes, the IB is an academically rigorous curriculum, a lot like APs are. And the APs have become much more, how should I say, interdisciplinary a little bit in terms of how they examine students. It's not, all multiple choice anymore, etc. But the IB it's like this whole program, and it's like you have to sort of indoctrinate yourself into the IB way of thinking, which isn't such a bad thing when you actually realize what its core values are. And I think another reason people are attracted to the IB, or that at least I myself find it to be a reasonably good program, is that they are and have been over the past couple of years, particularly from the time I was a student, they've put a lot of effort into articulating the kinds that, they don't want to churn out just uber smart people. They want young people who are going to go into the world today to be good communicators, to be able to navigate different cultures and different perspectives, and be a leader in such situations, but not necessarily, at the forefront, but to be a catalyst, bring about positive change. They want to churn out people who can grow wherever they're planted. And so, they really do have what I think are very ambitious, but also, noble aspirations. The challenge, though, is there's such a big organization. And sometimes, like any curriculum or, academic program, it's very difficult to take, the idea and then actually take that idea and have it executed properly in the classroom. And as teachers, you're often left unsure what it is that the IB wants you to do. And there are a lot of things that you end up doing to document, that you're following the IB guidelines and what they want you to do, which end up feeling like a lot of box ticking exercises, which is time you could spend actually developing a good lesson. So, but that's not unique to the IB. But I think particularly with the IB, if there's one, besides that, the one big thing that I find is that they ask too much of the kids, that it's way too much. I've got kids who don't go to bed until 3-4 o'clock in the morning. Many nights in a row. I remember from high school, I just remember being exhausted. And I didn't have a social life. I went to bed at 10 o'clock at night, but I had a really regimented life.
Yeah.
And it's like, there are ways to do this that does not require piling more and more work on these kids, because at some point they're not absorbing anything.
And my understanding is, so for the AP, I teach at AP school, the students who excel academically can just take many APs. So some kids take 5-6 APs, and some kids who take 0 or 1. With the IB, everyone has to fulfill their CAS requirements. Everyone takes DPs. There's a test for everyone, the big essay.
There's 2 ways you can do the IB. You can either be a diploma candidate, and if you're going to go to a university in the UK, often they'll require you to be a diploma candidate. Or you can be a course candidate. And a course candidate is a lot like the AP style, where you can just take IB classes. You don't get what's called the IB diploma at the end. And to get the IB diploma, you have to take 6 courses plus theory of knowledge, which is like an introduction to philosophy. And the reason that's called theory of knowledge is because when the IB program started, I guess the French delegates and the British delegates argued because the French wanted a philosophy course, the British didn't. So the compromise was that they would have this theory of knowledge. That's one theory that I've heard. But and so each subject comes from like a discipline area. So language, social studies, math, sciences, and something else. And then you have to complete your CAS requirements, which is approximately 150 hours of creativity, action, and service. And you have to write, I think they did away with the hour requirements, but you have to write these really detailed reflections and submit those. And so there's that. And then you have to write an extended essay, which is basically like a graduation thesis. And it's, I think, at maximum 4,000 words. And you have an advisor, but the advisor can't really tell you what to write. You have to be in the driver's seat. And so there's that requirement. And then each subject has an exam at the end of 2 years, which are divided into 3 papers. So 3 separate exam papers. So like, for example, the biology exam takes 2 days. And the first paper is a multiple choice paper. And depending on, and the other thing is, if you're in a diploma candidate, you have to take at least 3 of your classes at higher level. And you can take a maximum of 4 higher level classes. And that just determines how much you study and, how much depth you go into any subject, as well as in the end, the higher level exams are a little bit longer.
Mm. And for the evaluation with the AP exams, for example, that it goes over to, I think Utah is, for whatever reason, one of their main headquarters, and you have a bunch of readers there. With the IB, each teacher has a little bit more autonomy and power over what a student's final evaluation is.
Yes and no. So 80% of the students' grade, I'm just speaking for biology, 80% of the students' grade comes from externally examined papers, so the exam papers at the end. I also am an IB examiner, so I actually grade these papers. But those get sent off, and just like the AP, there are examiners who examine them. And then 20% of their grade comes from the internal assessment. And so in the case of, they change it every couple of years, but right now for the sciences, it's called the individual investigation. And think of it as like middle school science fair, except they do it independently and over the course of 10 hours. And so they carry out their own experiment. They write it all up in under 12 pages. And then we grade that according to the rubric that's given to us. And then we send the scores to the IB. The IB then sends back a list of students whose work they want to see. And we scan those and send them to them, and they moderate it.
So it's almost like a random drug test for athletes, basically. It's really random.
Yeah. So usually the top tier and the bottom tier and someone in the middle. And basically, like they're basically, it's like they're not checking the kids' work, they're checking my marking. And they want to, if like, for example, I've marked too harshly, then they will increase everybody's grade up by a certain factor. And if I've marked too leniently, they will bump everyone's grade down.
Wow.
So what me and my colleague do is before we send off any marks, we moderate each other's. And so far, knock on wood, we've not been moderated up or down for the past 7 years.
Oh, that's great to hear. And that sounds like it's part of the IB ethos too, right? This idea of co-teaching. And 20% is an interesting figure. I was just trying to do kind of the math in my head. It's just enough so that you can kind of help push a student up a little bit, but it's also not very substantial that if a student, doesn't do well, they don't do well. And if they do well, they do well.
This is like, last year, particularly with COVID, they canceled the exams. And so, the 20% IA actually, turned out to carry a lot more weight. There's still a big mystery about how those, how the final grades were determined.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of arguments and disputes over it because they used some sort of algorithm that they didn't really explain. That's the other thing about the IB is that they don't explain anything. And you just sort of have to, this is what you're going to do, and you just have to say okay. And there's no room for argument at all. Yeah,
that's the exact same problem with College Board, and a part of it's just I think they just don't want to deal with it. There's always disputes about essay grades for the AP capstone class that I teach, and unfortunately we haven't had to deal with that. We've been actually quite satisfied, fortunately, with our assessments. But I know online there's always a storm of this might be interesting for people who aren't teachers. Like, there's the teacher groups for the different APs and IBs, and it just the comments just go, my student won a science award, yet and the AP gets out of 5 points, and but she got a 3, but yeah, fortunately for us, we haven't had to deal with it. But at least from what I hear, it's just a real logistical nightmare.
Yeah, and you just sort of like, it's such I find it really challenging, being a teacher. And my friends, I have a lot of teacher friends, but I also have family members and friends who are not in teaching. And, we're coming up to the holiday season, and I always find like, it's very difficult to have conversations because I always either feel left out because I can't talk about business. And when I start talking about teaching and all the stuff that, we deal with, it's like everyone just has nothing to say because they have no way of sort of like no familiarity with this world.
It's very different, yeah, from other jobs, but especially international.
Yeah.
But yeah, your story of just, wow, Japanese public school, Wales, Saint Maur. And I mean, that's really cool that you still have this, I was going to say still have this close connection, but I feel like that's kind of an understatement with the institution. Because I mean, you work there.
Well, it was partially also because, they gave me a job because I wanted to work in international schools. And I decided to become a teacher pretty late, actually. I think it was the summer before my senior year that I worked at the International School of Asia, Karuizawa. I was a summer camp counselor.
Oh, yeah.
I fell in love. I was like, all throughout high school, I wanted, all I wanted to do was get out of high school. That was my main goal. And yet I was like, wow, it really felt like a calling. Like, oh, wow, I could make a difference in someone's life just because of the fact that I went through something similar. And then I did the undergraduate teacher education program that the Harvard Graduate School of Education offers, which was really intense because I had to do that and satisfy all the graduation requirements my senior year. But that gave me a teaching license. I had to take the test, but it gave me a teaching license, which I thought would give me a little bit of a leg up when I was applying to international schools. So I sent out, I think, like 50 or 60 resumes to different schools. And, I sent one to Saint Maur and they were like, you want to come in for an interview? Nice to hear from you.
Yeah.
So it was a good outcome, I think.
And to those, again, aren't part of the teaching tribe, there's sort of this ironic situation where every job requires 2 years experience. and so it's very hard for anyone getting their feet wet. You said you applied to about 60 schools, and I assume you didn't hear back from a lot, or
yeah, and because a lot of the alternative was go work in a public school in the U.S. But I was like, I have no background in American public schools. I have no idea what I'm getting myself into. Although I did teacher training, my teacher training. But that was at Lexington High School, which is, like 99.9% of the kids who go there are white, upper middle class, destined for Ivy League schools. And, and it just, I considered Teach for America, but I knew myself well enough that I was like, I'm going to burn out. And that's, I think, had I done it, it would have been a rewarding experience, but I think it would have burnt me out. I would get so angry at the lack of social infrastructure that led to schools being that run down.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of a crusade at that point, and it's hard enough to teach. It's hard enough to actually control, your classroom. Going on a whole crusade to change, the socioeconomic status of a city or a district is just, I feel like, a whole nother.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of respect. I have some friends who went into TFA, and I have a tremendous respect for them because, I teach privileged kids, and I come from a privileged background, and I know that there are things that I just cannot even pretend to understand. And what I find, what really works, or at least, what I see is with kids is, at least when I was a kid, what really touched me or got my attention was when an adult was able to connect with me because they met me at my level. And I had a sense that they understood what I was going through. And if I felt even the slightest bit that this person has no idea what I'm going through, then I just turned off.
Yeah.
And it's such a delicate, thing because kids are smart and they see a lot and they can interpret a lot more than we realize.
Definitely.
And so,
I agree with you. I think there's this fallacy where people just try to basically say, well, kids' brains aren't developed. But no, it's like they are perceptive. They do have an idea. And I actually have the exact same experience as you, where because I come from a private school, rather privileged background, my strengths and weaknesses are very apparent. Like if you threw me into a public school in Oakland, there's just like, it would actually be a detriment. It would kind of be like, what does this guy know? And I don't know. Whereas throw me into international school, it's like, I know exactly what you guys are going through. I know exactly what's going on here, and I can contribute. And as you said, the kids know more than we think, especially the high school age kids. They know, they know, which colleges you went to, and they know what hobbies you have. Like they're perceptive. So yeah, we been conversing for a little over an hour now, and I just want to sort of bring us towards the end of the podcast, where I like to ask the guests at the end what is coming up in their lives for the next few years, next few decades. I know with COVID, there are a lot of uncertainties, but despite those uncertainties, if you could share with us what is to come.
Well, hopefully, one of the things that me and my partner are trying to work on over the next couple of years is we really want to be parents. And so we sort of started that journey. And, we just have to see how the cookie crumbles, but, hopefully that's something in the future. Another thing that I'm, hopefully going to work on is the book or collection of essays that I was mentioning, try and make some progress on that. But I think definitely the biggest thing I think is starting a family and seeing where that journey takes us, which will be an adventure, but hopefully one that has lots of rewards, just like teaching has.
Awesome. So books and babies and books.
Yes. You can put it that way.
Well, it was great having you, and we're in the same industry, so I'm sure our paths will cross sometime, especially post-COVID, when we can actually travel around.
Yes.
For now, I guess we'll stay put in our respective countries. And that was episode 46. Anna Novick, thank you for being our guest.